Um, is it starting? Yes, because Read AI is obviously already reading and listening. So, welcome everyone. We are so happy to have Schirin here in our small network and hopefully growing network. The network is by Peter. I don't know if he's already in the call. Peter is a professor at Delft. My name is Bettina. I'm a professor here in Munich at the University of Applied Science. And Peter and I will work on the topic to be more patient-centered in our education, in innovation and entrepreneurship. And we are teaching people from different faculties, students from different faculty, bachelor and master, to change the health system and not just to provide innovative solutions, but really change the health system towards increasing the health status, but overall giving also everyone access to high quality health services. And it's a long way to go, but we are looking for like-minded people who are, working on the same cause. And I know Schirin is one of my partners in crime. Let me phrase it like this. I know Schirin by a network partner from the Bay Area already since 3 years. And I was so impressed by her attitude, her passion, and her expertise. And she supported me in my work as an educator in healthcare since many months. And she's always a welcomed speaker. So, Shirin, I would give you the floor. Please introduce yourself. Of course, also your latest book. We are very eager to learn you, your work, and your insights. And I do not know if you would like then to open up, but you are in the driver's seat for the next 57 minutes. Thank you very much for being here.
Wonderful. Thank you. Thank you for the warm introduction and welcome, Bettina. It's always a pleasure to be here, and it's so nice to see some familiar names. I don't see any faces, but I'm just gonna wave to you, and it's lovely to see you. Hi. I'm just out of curiosity, how many of you work already in the hospital context, in the setting for need finding? Just like I don't know if you want to do a show of hands without a camera, I think you can still raise your hands like a little bit. Okay. Yes. Okay. And okay, so also some people are not in the hospital at all. Um, who's more on the med tech side and does medical device development, but is sort of like more adjacent to the hospital and the clinical care setting? Okay. And do we have any people who are just interested in healthcare but don't work in healthcare? No. Okay, good. So we can kind of like all nerd out on healthcare stuff. Exciting. Good. So I basically prepared for you a case study on which also our book is based on, and also a few approaches that we've learned over the, gosh, almost can say decades of doing research in the healthcare context. And one thing that I personally am like find really important to emphasize is need finding. We don't do that for the sake of need finding, but we do need finding in order to find insights. But the insights fuel the design and the implementation and the impact. So at the end of the day, it's all about the impact and how we get there. There are multiple ways of getting there. There's some people who have done great work with very different tools. And what I'm sharing is just like one of the many creative processes that we found helpful and that we are practicing. So my name is Schirin Lucy Richter, and I'm partner at Future Medical Systems. And I'll tell you a little bit more about myself and Future Medical Systems. But since Bettina already mentioned the book, we published in 2018 together with the Risk Authority at Stanford University a handbook for healthcare innovation. It was supposed to be this little booklet that you slip in your pocket. It now is great as a door stopper. You can elevate your monitor with it. So we very quickly learned in the healthcare context, there is no little booklet. We had great success with it and used it now also in a global context for healthcare innovation, because one of the main critiques is, oh, Stanford, they're flush with money, so they can do lots of things. But how do you actually do it in a public health setting? So we're very excited to name a few of our public hospitals now as clients. And one client that I can mention is the Landspítali in Reykjavik in Iceland. And we're currently working with a team there in more of a coaching model to do exactly this kind of work, following this process. And the area there is reimagining the experience for dialysis patients. So this book went really well. And then the University of Toronto Press got interested in it. So it's basically now a second edition. It's updated. Since then, we've had a global pandemic. We've had diversity, equity, and inclusion as like one of the main topics in many places in the world. And we also had the opportunity to have all our content peer reviewed. So this is the book that is coming out in spring 2025, so this year. And unfortunately, I don't have a copy, but of the Discovery Design later on, I have a QR code for you so you can actually download the PDF of Discovery Design. So we are Future Medical Systems. We are seasoned designers, system thinkers, engineers, architects, UX designers that work with the main focus being healthcare. And we were founded over 10 years ago, and since then had the opportunity to really get our feet wet in all different areas of healthcare. And one thing that sometimes confuses folks is like, hang on, you work with health insurance and you work in care delivery and you do med tech. From our standpoint, it's all about understanding the stakeholders and developing a company strategy, and how the implementation happens. That then is company specific, but the needs and the strategy really are rooted within the healthcare space. So myself, I am an anthropologist and linguist by training. I advise and coach startups. As Bettina said, like I work with a lot of deep tech accelerators here in Germany. And I'm also an affiliated scholar with Stanford School of Medicine, the Clinical Excellence Research Center. My colleague Rob Lister is a mechanical engineer turned system thinker. Kara Harrington is a service designer and also an industrial designer. And Lizzie Garrett, our fourth partner, she has the UX background as well as the architect lens. And with that, we're able to do work that is in care settings where we really look at how do we need to rethink the environment all the way to what are the technical tools that we want to look at. Now, one thing that's really important to us is that everything starts and ends with people. So we have been trained, you might call it brainwashed in design thinking, but it's just one of these approaches that for us has just really shown results in the way that we're practicing it. And it's really about looking at the real life experiences. It's one thing when Stanford Hospital told us, oh yeah, we have safety reports and they get filed when we have a medication safety issue. It's a different thing to then interview the nurses and ask like, well, when would you actually file a report? And then to hear stories such as, you know, if it's in our own team, we don't file a report. If it's with another team and we like them, we don't file a report. But if we don't like them, we'll file a report. And those are kind of like really interesting nuances that then show us what is going on and not just the number of reports that exist. And that insight really led the entire organization to rethink the safety measures and safety reporting that was happening. We power insights to action. So for us, it's really important to really take those insights and ask, so what? So what can we do with that? And then to scale through iterative prototypes and pilots. Over the years, we've developed methods to actually pilot within hospitals. It's very important to make the infectious disease folks your best friends, because they need to understand when you bring a prototype in and how do we create safe spaces, because we don't want to put anyone at risk. None of us would want someone to operate with a prototype on us, right? Like these are really important things where we do have a regulatory and a safety mindset. However, sometimes the safety mindset can be so restrictive that it's actually really challenging for teams to try out something new. So how do we find that right balance? So over the years, our impact has been in the med tech space, in the care delivery space. It's often harder to show images of workflows, and it's much easier to show things that make a sound when you drop them. But in general, we can say that we have 4 areas. So one is definitely the innovation management and venture building, and how to help organizations find their way in the healthcare system. Another area is med tech, pharma, and then we have also insurance, where we look at a lot of what are products to help serve the most vulnerable and most high-need patients, their members, and then also care delivery. And care delivery is really one of the areas that we find so ripe for innovation, because it's often not the fancy new technology that makes a difference, but it's identifying the right workflow, the right communication, and moments that really unlock hostility sometimes between teams, and really align the teams to unlock for them to generate the most impact. And that's also what the case study for the book was based on, with medication safety. So we've innovated with a ton of different clients all over the space. Our focus is still with the majority in the US, but more and more growing in Europe. So for us, it's really about people, and many of you, this is no big news, but starting with desirability and really understanding, what do people want? Because it's very easy for us then to adjust business and technology or regulatory to it, but it's very hard to go against human nature. So when certain workflows and patterns, like behavioral patterns, are existing, it's very hard to change them. I mean, there's nothing like more impossible than behavior change. It is possible, but again, what we find in the workspace is when we actually know these workflows, we can find solutions that fit much better. And then, similar to a lot of agencies, we also focus on the double diamond, where the first phase of the projects are really about defining the right problem to solve. And then the second phase about solving the right problem in the most elegant way. And there are lots of examples where the problem was identified, but then it just wasn't solved in the best possible way. So there are multiple moments throughout the design process where things can actually fall through the cracks. And this here is a framework by Peter Merholz, but this is kind of what we like to use to show how need finding is really in the beginning, and then we go through these multiple iterations of envisioning, framing opportunities, and really aligning teams. Like, so often we find that the process that we take organizations through is the process of listening, and especially in the hospital setting, to include frontline staff. Many of them are used to initiatives coming top down. We've heard quotes like, there's a new pilot, well, we'll just duck and wait until it's over, and then we can actually go back and do our work. Now, this is not how we work. We like to include people, to have them see their fingerprints all over the designs, to really build momentum. And what we achieved that way, for example, with the medication safety project, was that at the end, like throughout the process, we had more and more nurses join the team. And at the end, it was the chief nursing officer who said, we have to make this initiative our initiative, because otherwise, we have nothing to show, and we need to show nurses that they're welcome and their ideas are welcome. So it was fascinating to see how an initiative with medication safety that started in the lawyer office, like the legal office of the Stanford Risk Authority, then migrated over to the chief nursing office, where it was all about organizational transformation and really nurse inclusion. But the process is not all of it. What we find is that having a mindset and the right team, that really kind of brings people together and makes action possible. And it's impossible that every person can be optimistic, empathic, inclusive, but it is possible that we actually have these skill set distributed across a team. So for example, with curious and action-oriented, here's my dear colleague, Rob Lister. It was a project on ear tube insertion, and he just went for it. He was like, I'm going to go to the ENT and go through all the steps to actually see what is it like for a child to get ready for ear tube insertion. Obviously, he didn't get the ear tubes inserted, but he took that step of being very action-oriented to develop that empathy. Now, somebody else might be like, this is not my cup of tea, and that's totally fine too. And what we like doing with teams before we get started is to actually have the spider diagram to just rank yourself and be like, you know what, where am I? Optimistic. I'm not an optimistic person, so I need someone on my team who is optimistic to balance this out. Maybe I'm like super empathic and action oriented, but with a curiosity, sometimes I don't want to ask these questions. So we find complementary teams and identify where the gaps are. And we found that that is like a really solid approach for teams to have the awareness and to also just know, hang on, we have nobody here who's thinking inclusively, to then basically wear the inclusivity hat in each different session and be like, okay, today it's your call. Like, think about inclusiveness because none of us naturally do. And sorry, some letters have jumped around here. So there's a QR code if you're interested in downloading these PDFs. There is basically these reflection tools. We have one for individuals and a second one for teams, because it's very interesting to rank your team and say, like, where are we at? But then also to rank yourself individually. And we use that as one of the very first activities. And if you miss it, later on, I show the QR code again. So qualitative research for need finding. I'm going to go a little bit more of a detour in theory, and then we'll come to the case study. Any one of you who works in this space, you know that the question is not what's the answer. The question really is, what is the question? And especially in today's world of AI, we all know if we don't ask the right question, we don't get the right answer. I think it's just teaching us how to become better at asking questions. And for the design process, it's the same story. Because at the end of the day, we really want to achieve a change of perspective. And any project that I've worked on, even when we're like, we have such a good hunch of what's going on, in the end, it's not a fish, but a duck, or the other way around. And it's in that process, the openness to define what is the actual problem that we're solving here, that we can actually make changes. And with medication safety, the assumption was that nurses get distracted. So distraction is one of the biggest issues why there's safety issues. And there's a lot of literature that talks about it, and it has been measured and observed. But at the same time, none of the solutions that were applied actually worked. And this is where Stanford Hospital, with the risk authority, approached us and said, you know what, can we just take a very unconventional approach to see what else can we do? And later on, you'll see that the solutions were more about how do you build communication? How do you build moments for safety in the workflows? So while distraction was still an issue, it became a reframing of looking at what other opportunities are there. So there are many names for need finding. Some people call it design research, qualitative research, like pick whatever you want. We find that the word design research and need finding kind of resonates. Some people prefer qualitative because it does go deep into the ethnography. However, we do include also secondary research as well as quant insights, because we feel like we want to paint that whole picture. Now, need finding is an attitude. It's about putting yourself in that hospital context and being very honest with yourself of like, I actually have no idea what I'm doing in the operating room, and being able to ask the person, be like, where should we stand? What should we wear? It's about the self-responsibility. Hang on, there's a code something right now. It's not about us and my need finding. I need to disappear, blend into the wall, get out of the way because people's lives are being saved. It's also about like the non-judgmental nature of it. A nurse might show us how she's preparing the medication, and we just talk to a senior nurse who's got this all figured out, but we don't want to judge. We just want to hear, what is this new nurse's way of doing it? What has she maybe figured out, but also what is she struggling with? Now, this is kind of need finding in general, and I am emphasizing ethical here because there's been like a lot of discussion around how need finding has become very extractive and taking advantage of people, but not actually giving back. But in the healthcare setting, there are a few other things that we also want to emphasize. One is regulatory. so often I encounter teams where it's like, yeah, I think we can just kind of skirt around that. From our perspective, this is not a good idea. We want to make, whether that is in a med tech or pharma context, compliance, regulatory people need to be our best friends. There's a very different culture of working together with them. However, it's it's an investment in the long run to make friends with them, to have them be included in the process, to know exactly what we're doing and to advise us. And often I find that when the first conversations have taken place, we get more of a warmer welcome. But in the beginning, it can be sometimes a little sticky. And in the hospital context, it's infectious disease control. It's really talking with people. So before we take any prototype into a hospital, we want to have a conversation with them beforehand about how do you clean it? Where do you store it? What is the risk around this? What material is this? So it's like a very thorough approach. And sometimes we hear teams who are like, oh, we don't have the time for that. We see it as an investment to make these solutions successful. Ethical. It's often okay for us to talk with staff versus where patients have, especially in the US, there's like the patient protection, the HIPAA laws, and where we're not allowed to talk with patients unless we have internal review, IRB approvals. But sometimes we forget about staff. And what we found, especially in the medication safety context, that it's very easy to reveal someone's identity and sharing a story and not knowing that they actually broke a rule or maybe even a law. So it's about walking this very fine line of how do we protect staff. So for example, we always ask them to turn their name badge around when we take photos. We never take photos of their faces. If they have a really big tattoo on their hands, we ask them to use their sleeve to cover it up, or we don't take photos of that. Really big jewelry, or if somebody has a hairdo where this is the hairdo of just one person, like we make sure that we don't take pictures. However, we do put processes in place should somebody really make big mistakes, break rules about medication safety. Like, what is our communication process to bring this up to the attention of the right people without turning into people who are like, oh, they're just there to see if we're doing it right, because then we can't do a need finding process. So it's like a very fine line to walk. And what we find is important to have these processes spelled out in the beginning so that our the people who give us the mandate, in this case it was the lawyer's office at the hospital, that they know we won't reveal people's identity. However, should there be often it's called like an adverse event, or here it's a safety breach, should something happen, this is our chain of commands of what we're going to do. And then there's trauma informed. And trauma informed is also particularly important for us in the healthcare context, not just because many patients, but even staff have experienced trauma. It's also because sometimes the healthcare system itself has inflicted trauma on patients. So especially when we work with patients who are high needs, who sometimes are called the high utilizers, who rotate in and out of the hospital. Many of them feel that every time they ask to tell their story, it's potentially re-traumatizing them. And just taking some very simple, and they're not very long or complex trainings, just puts that mindset in place to walk into the hospital context with a little bit, like treading a little bit more carefully. And we found that investment goes a long way. So just as an overview, our goals are that we want to develop empathy for people's real-world problems and context, and this is patients, caregivers, family, but also administrators. Many of them really suffer in the healthcare context with all the layers of bureaucracy that they have to deal with. We want to uncover the hidden and unmet needs. Often these are not things that people say exactly, but it's what we have to use our intuition to basically say, hang on, like we're seeing a pattern here. What does that mean? We want to identify opportunities for future solutions, define meaningful problems, and really inform our intuition. So when we go into the design phase, that we actually know what to do, and to gather inspiration, because people are having like really cool workarounds that do great work, but nobody is looking. Nobody knows how they're doing. So sometimes the solutions are really about amplifying a solution that somebody else is just doing alone to actually have an entire team benefit from it. And we find that it's valuable because it actually reduces risk. So by doing a thorough need finding process and also iterative prototyping, it just helps us to bring down the resources that are needed and also to avoid innovating in the wrong direction and making an investment and later finding out that it's actually not helpful. So the right problem to solve, and obviously with that, we're increasing product market fit. So I'm going to move to the case study now, but if anybody has a pressing question, I'm happy to pause here for a bit. Okay, the ones I can see are shaking their heads. I don't see any raised hands, so I'm just going to continue. But please chime in. We're such a small group, so it's always nice to make this like interactive. So with the work, as I already mentioned, it was how do we reduce the harm from medication errors? Now, medication errors hardly ever happen. Like the studies are that like it's kind of like looking for a needle in the haystack, but then actually when you look at the sum of it, it's actually quite substantial. So the question was all about how do we reduce distraction, but what it ended up was really about how to build a safety culture and how to create a solution that really empowers and engages all the stakeholders rather than points the fingers at people. And maybe some of you have heard about the law case that took place, gosh, I think it was last year in Texas, where a nurse, because of a medication error, was actually found guilty. And what that led to was a lot of nurses resigning, especially the ones who are about to retire. They're like, why am I putting my life at risk? And like, I'm about to go into retirement. I don't want to go to jail. So it's a very, still a very hot topic. And what we found was that with the solution that we offered, we actually were able to decrease the nurse interruptions by 55% and also to save a calculated one annual nurse salary on the ward that then could be spread across different activities. So it didn't mean that one person was needed less. It just meant that this person could actually focus on other improvement initiatives. But this is just a snapshot, so I'm going to take you through the details. So the problem, nurses don't embrace interventions. So there are lots of studies out there that have shown when you make them wear a vest, like here, not that I'm a reader of the Daily Mail, but sometimes the Daily Mail says it really well, like do not disturb, fury over nurse uniforms that ban patients from trying to speak to them. So obviously written very black and white, but it also talks about like, the moment a nurse is wearing something like this, it breaks a social contract. And the social contract is, I'm your nurse, I'm here for you. And nurses didn't like that. So what we found was that the studies later on said, yeah, after the study was over, people would not wear those vests. In another context, they were asked to have blinking bike lights. So the moment they focused on medication, they were supposed to switch on that light. The battery ran out. Oh, how convenient. Why did nobody replace the battery? So all these are indicators to us that it's not a solution that's desired. Because if this was helpful to nurses, the batteries would have been replaced, the vests would have been put on, but they are not. So the question was like, what are interventions that actually nurses would say, yes, give us more of that? So we started out with the data and already shared about the safety reports and the published research on the topics, but it was really about like taking like a really good look at the organization. And in many cases, when we work with organizations, they've already done this sort of work before they bring us in, but it's always good for us to wrap our heads around it. Like, what is going on? How does a report like this look like? And what are sort of initiatives that have been tried out? And then the next part really is about immersing ourselves in the context. So here, and if you notice the photography, like you see that we don't show faces. Like these are people where unless you know exactly which ward it was, you just don't know. And yet they create this picture of, yeah, we were there, we saw this. So we spent time following nurses, and in the US, these workstations on wheels, they used to be computer on wheels. They used to be called cows until one patient felt offended because she thought she was overweight and she thought they meant them. So now they call them workstations on wheels. We followed people along. We said like, okay, show us, where do you take the medications out? And here at Stanford Hospital, they have Pyxis machines where the pharmacists stock them up with the meds. And then as you take the meds out as the nurse, you hold your badge against it. So there's like these double checks. And then there are also some safety checks for high alert medications where you actually need two people to sign off. So we followed along. And what we realized was how much of a disconnect had happened between the pharmacy and the nurses. So until a few years before this, nurses and pharmacists would still be in touch. And then they moved the entire pharmacy into the basement. And the only people who would show up on the wards would be the farm techs who would fill up the Pyxis machine. So there was no accidental running into each other and talking about medications, patients anymore. It was all very kind of removed. And when we initially talked about it, pharmacy was not even on the table. And it was only through these immersions where we're like, you know what, we really want to talk with pharmacy. What is it like for them? And what we heard there was like, you get a phone, you get messages through the electronic health record system, and Stanford uses Epic. And there they tell you they're very nice and friendly, but then they pick up the phone and they yell at you and you don't know what's going on. And the communication started breaking down. And a lot of it happened because in the electronic health records, the nurses have what they call these short phrases. So with certain key combinations, they can already write the entire sentence of, I kindly request the farm tech to deliver this medication to the oncology infusion center. And they use these fragments of sentences, and they're all pre-written, and they're all very kind and very nice. And it's in the EHRs, so it's documented. Nobody wants to say, where are the meds? But when they pick up the phone, that's when a very different nurse shows up. So pharmacy was like very confused of like, what's going on here? The other thing that we learned, that the nurses were very confused, because here we have two nurses who are actually picking up a high alert drug. And as they're doing it, they're being prompted by the Pyxis machine, please count the colace in tray 28. Colace is a stool softener. It's not a medication that needs a lot of attention. Why is the machine prompting two nurses in a moment where they are verifying a high alert drug to count the colace in tray 28 and to make sure that it's really 36 tablets that are in there? Now, those are moments where the system already breaks down. And it was actually later on in a meeting where we brought pharmacy nurses together, where the farm tech spoke and were like, oh, we didn't know that. We can change that. And again, it was a moment where the nurses were like, why did you even set it up that way? And the farm tech was like, because we didn't know. We had no idea that this could happen. And so bringing these stories to each other already helped solve many of the other challenges. We also spent time in the OR, and because initially we had anesthesiologists included, and it became very clear very quickly that when one of the anesthesiologists makes a mistake, only the pharmacist knows, and the mistake then goes away. So it was like a moment where it was like, okay, the focus of this project is going to be nurses at the bedside and their medication administration. And this was exactly the meeting. We have here a patient representative, we have someone from pharmacy, we have nurses, we have people from obviously the Stanford Risk Authority, the lawyers, and everybody sitting there together. And for the very first time, talking about medication safety. And already some of the low-hanging fruit was resolved right there. And we do these meetings, and they're deliberately written. Like now these days, it's like on digital whiteboards since the pandemic, but this was before the pandemic, so it's handwritten. And there's an intention behind that, and that is, should anybody come up to this and be like, no, this is not how I see it. We capture their input as well, and we can just cross something out and be like, hey, thanks for telling us this. And what we find is that when people who see it differently, who have way more experience, can actually give their input and start seeing their own fingerprints all over it, that we get more alignment. Marion, was that a question, or? I saw you raise your hand. No? Okay. So out of all of this resulted 4 different areas to work on medication safety. One was to engage patients and caregivers. Another one was to ignite positive communication between pharmacy and the nurses who were administering the drugs, but also the prescribers. We also had a reduced burden, and we had an elevate the craft. Elevate the craft for us actually was like the most exciting one, because these were all the nurses that had figured it out, to actually allow them to host workshops to tell everybody else, but we couldn't get the organization on board with that, unfortunately. However, after shopping these ideas around, our client realized that the easiest one to start off with would be engaging patients and caregivers. And with that, we started a collaboration with the transplant unit at Lucille Packard Children's Hospital. So it's the Children's Hospital of Stanford. And it was one unit. And this was a unit, they were identified as like, yeah, they have a little bit more freedom. They can do things differently. There was one nurse that was called the maker nurse because they had one patient who had a Berlin heart, and she had figured out a way with fabric and Velcro to actually wrap it around the body of like the 4 or 5 year old patient to keep it in place. And they were told, yeah, you can do this because we want you to figure things out. And so they had already a little bit more flexibility. And together with them, we looked at this concept of how do you engage a patient or the caregiver? And the assumption is that who has the greatest interest in medication safety? And it kind of is the parents in the children's hospital. It's the patient themselves. They want to be safe. They don't want to be put at risk. So how do we give them a role? And this was a very initial storyboard where we had ideas around like, maybe we can name it and call it Meds Time, or maybe we can have like an app that alerts patients what the steps are and what are happening. And maybe we can give nurses a way of calling it Meds Time so that the patient knows now is not that time to ask for applesauce or how does the TV work, right? Because nurses are asked about all these things. Now, for us to go in with a concept to a group of nurses and tell them this is how we think this could work is not going to fly because we just don't know what their pain points are. So what we actually did was we spend more time with them. Sorry, still on this one. And we spend more time with them to actually learn about their day-to-day. And we shadowed them again. We looked at the concepts. And then we said, how would you do this? So the very first workshop was actually a workshop where we asked them, how would you bring these ideas to life? Go over them with a red pen. Whatever doesn't work, cross it out, like make this your own. And one of the things that we discovered was that what the nurses really don't know is in the children's hospital, does a patient want to be woken up or not? Do the parents of the patient want to be woken up or not? So if you are in the transplant unit and you have families, they have 2, 3 kids, the parents are there for the 7th time and they know exactly what's happening. And then comes the nurse and it's 6:30 and wakes them up. They're like, come on, please let me sleep. On the other hand, you have parents, first time in the hospital, no idea what's going on. They wake up, are nurses with their kid. They're like, hang on, why are you touching my child? So for the nurses to come into the room with a new patient was always anxiety because you just don't know what's expected of you. The second thing we realized was that nurses have no idea what the preferred way of administering the medication is. So for example, children that in the transplant unit have been on multiple medications, but the parents have figured out you got to crush this tablet and mix it in applesauce. This one does not work in applesauce, but you can half it and wrap it in something. So parents have figured it out, but nurses don't know about it. So all of this information was precious to the nurses. And they were like, if you can get us this information, we're happy to talk about medication safety. So the ideas that came out of this together with the nurses was really, let's talk about meds. So at check-in, like at patients' admissions, to really ask these questions and capture that information. At the same time, a series of posters that talks about what is medication administration time, like what happens. And as we tested those ideas with the families, there was one dad who was like, oh my goodness, I mean, I figured that the nurse wasn't on Facebook, but I didn't realize she was putting something in about my son's medication. And like he turned completely pale. He was like, I think I interrupted her. And he just didn't have that awareness otherwise. And with that, the nurses were like, okay, we're doing Meds Time now so that the patients and parents could also be aligned. And many times it was also inviting the patients to be like, does this look familiar? Especially the teenagers. It's like, do you notice anything that's different about the meds? Please speak up. And what we then realized is here we're standing, here's Rob, my colleague, we're standing here with 2 nurses in front of a patient room. And this was the first time we tried it out. These were ideas that the nurses had come up with. So we're like standing in front of the room, and all of a sudden the nurse shakes her hand and is like, no, I don't think I can do it. And we're like, why? We just practiced this. Like, what's going on? And she was like, I might freak out the parents. And that's exactly then what happened. So, in a way, trying out these ideas in the context brought up more ways that we needed to bring these ideas to life. And this is where it also started to start talking about similar like on an airplane. You get the TSA announcement in the US or here the safety announcement, and it doesn't mean that something is going to happen to this plane. It just means that we all need to be aligned around safety. And here we are again with the nurses. And here is Soren, he's our graphic designer. Here's Simon, who's a lawyer. And these are the two nurses who looked at all the different posters and were like, yeah, we like this. We don't like this. This wasn't working. And it was again like with their collaboration that we were able to create that poster. And here's a fun fact. So the first posters had like, you see here, like pills, medications, a nurse with a computer. And what they told us was patients didn't look at this because they thought it was communication directed at other healthcare providers. And that's when we made that big switch to the birds. And the birds was like, oh, the birds, that's cutesy things, children's hospital. And the parents were reading it. And it was just remarkable how such a design change actually led to the parent engagement. So with that, we were told you can never make a change in the electronic health record. But since we had more and more nurses, in the end, we had what was called an IT nurse. And we're like, what's an IT nurse? And they were like, yeah, she knows how to make some changes in the electronic health record. And we're like, wow, that's cool. So they brought her to one meeting. She looked at the whole thing. And the next day, she basically was like, I think I figured out a way where to put it. So she included it in what is called the MAR note. It's a medication administration note, and it's specific to Epic. And she was actually able to include all these questions in the admissions process. So any child that is being admitted to Lucille Packard Stanford Children's Hospital is being asked, how are you taking your medication at home? Do the parents want to be woken up or not? And another set of questions like, can your child swallow pills? No, they have to be crushed. And with that information, the nurses were able to reduce the time because when they don't know that a medication had to be halved or crushed, they would have to leave the patient room again, find the pill crusher, the pill halfer. In the meantime, somebody would come to us like, hey, it's such and such birthday. Could you please sign the birthday card? So we have interruption number one, and that is not even a medical interruption. And then we have all the other interruptions. But by having this information, they were able to gather all the things, knowing patient such and such needs the pill crusher, he prefers chocolate sauce, and what else do I need? They could go into the room and have everything ready together with the medication. And this is kind of really post-implementation feedback that we got, where the nurse was really saying this project focused on what we nurses have to say, and we produced results, real results. So often improvement work fails. This is, on the other hand, was true nurse empowerment, hands-on, group-led, and built. This increases nurse satisfaction, which is needed here, especially because Stanford does not have a nurse practice. The School of Medicine only trains doctors. And the patient's father, like, oh no, I distracted the nurse. So I already told you that story. So again, taking a step back from like a resource mindset around prototyping, had we immediately gone for let's reduce distractions, we probably would have created solutions that would have used up a lot of resources, and maybe they also would have been similar to the bike lights where the lights don't get, the batteries don't get replaced. But by doing this different approach, we were actually able to generate a cultural momentum and contribute to the safety culture and communication. So the overall results, as I mentioned earlier, was 55% decrease in the interruptions, the 6 minutes saved per meds pass, and then overall more bandwidth to focus on other healthcare interventions that are needed. Now, bringing these ideas from life, obviously, they didn't all start out as like the winning solutions. We had multiple caterpillars, many of them that turned into cocoons, many that never hatched. And in the end, the ones that did hatch and took on wings were the ones that worked. And that's also where the idea of the approach of having lots of ideas in the beginning and then narrowing down as we move forward really paid off. Another way of looking at it is to see how, with time, how we had insights in the beginning to learn what are the things that are important is, from a dollar perspective, not that expensive. And especially now that we're doing it with hospital teams where the teams do the work. So we coach them. We have once a week, for example, with the Landspitali Hospital in Reykjavik, once a week I sit down with a team. At times we have little work sessions and workshops, but it's actually work that teams can take on and push forward by themselves. We then look at the evolution of the ideas. This is where we develop the ideas. Here we have more iterations of printing and different like flyers that we tried out with different language to really tap into what fits in the behaviors and in the workflows. And then the expression here where we already had like the big posters and at the same time nurses were capturing the metrics. Earlier, people actually had step trackers, so we could see how many steps would nurses do on their shifts before the intervention and after the intervention. So we use a whole bunch of metrics. These are kind of like weird adjacent metrics, but these are metrics that show that something is happening before we then move into metrics to actually talk about safety measures. And then impact, where we scaled. This is when, just when the idea was about to launch, we learned that the hospital was moving into the new building already. And we were told that they didn't want any flyers or posters. So everything had to be digitally. And that's when we realized, hang on, we're still in the process of refining. So here we're trying out, can we maybe have like a little hook on the monitor to put the flyers here just for another week until we figure out what the exact implementation could be digitally. So it's really a process of learning. And with that, I've come to the end of the presentation. Here at the bottom, you have a QR code. I hope you can really see that one. A QR code to download Discovery Design. So again, be mindful, it is 300 and something pages. So if you print it out, it's a great doorstopper. You can also get it on Amazon. And if you're interested particularly in generative research, so Needfinding, then chapter 2 and 3 are sort of the ones that will help you the most. But the book covers the entire process. I don't have access to the next iteration of the book yet, but as soon as I have it, I will pass it on to Bettina. And also up here, in case you missed it, we have a QR code for the worksheets. And the worksheets have the canvas for the teams, but I also added some worksheets of when we actually have a prototype, what sort of questions to run the prototype through, and the experience storyboard to really pressure test these ideas. And these are just tools that we found that really help hospital teams, design teams to ask questions, particularly to the healthcare setting. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I thank the ones that had their cameras on. It's always nice to see faces, and I understand that not everybody can do this. And now I'm handing over to Bettina.
I have one question. So we have a couple of educators here, Schirin, and many of our students are working with computers, of course, and there are platforms like Miro and Mural. And I remember at your time at IDEO, you had rooms full of post-its and data. So you have been surrounded by patient data. And what I recognize also when I started working with design thinking, that we had the patient data and the personas actually almost in full size in our rooms. And that made something with us, how we approached projects, how we led the discussions. What are your lessons learned regarding data collection, no, more data sharing and working with field data in the age of digitalization?
Absolutely, that's a great question. So what we found are a couple of different things. One is that Miro and any of these other whiteboards, I mean, they're fantastic. They allow me to continue working with a team in Iceland and to actually have a shared workspace. But there's certain moments in the process where we find that it doesn't allow the thinking to expand. And there's something about being focused on a screen, being focused on just like a very small view, that we find it's actually helpful to go back to some of the project spaces. So for example, with the Icelandic team, what we did was we had Miro to capture the stories of the patient interviews. And I want to be very careful here. This is not patient data because we're actually not taking patient data. We're actually just taking whatever patient told us in an anonymized way. And we captured that in often we create little templates like what are 3 to 5 things that really stood out? What are 1 or 2 quotes that really resonated with us? Like, for example, this quote here from the father was like, oh my God, I distracted a nurse. Like those are just like really powerful emotional quotes. But then we actually met for a synthesis workshop. And in that workshop, what we did together, it was a 3-person team and myself. We actually went through each of these personas again and did like a mini storytelling to refresh our memories. And from that, we started writing down things that stood out to us on post-it notes. We had one project space for the 3 days. And in that time, we were like, let's just take the things that really stood out to us. And with that, we created an entire patient journey. In this case, was around dialysis. And it was this question of like, how's and like the one thing that really was a huge insight to us is like how in dialysis you have an on day and an off day, and how we had a lot of information of what happens on the on day in the hospital and how we had hardly any information of what happens during the off day. So it also helped us identify gaps that the team was later on able to fill. But I have to say that journey mapping worked much better in person. So we did that in person. We took photos of it and then basically moved the pictures back on Miro. And then we worked on the graphic design to actually lay out the entire patient experience, which then was printed on large post-its and presented at the annual conference of the hospital. Does that answer
Yeah,
your question?
yeah, it's definitely answer that we also as educators should have a mixture between tangible physical working and digital working and not over emphasize the value of digitalization. I have to look a little bit on the time because Peter and myself, we have exam oversight today. Um, so you see the email address of Schirin. I highly recommend to pre-order her latest book. It's also in the chat, and I thank you again, Schirin. So the drinks in Munich are on me. We will find a time and date to
We
meet.
should.
And there's also the LinkedIn account of Schirin, so please feel free to reach out to her. She is making a living with her knowledge, so in case you would like to hire her, I can highly recommend it. We do not have the topic for the upcoming call, but we will inform you. Peter, any final note?
I wanted to thank you very much. We haven't been able to meet each other yet, but I've heard great things from Bettina, and it's really wonderful to have you here in this speaking to us all. And we started this new network about patient entrepreneurship, which is very exciting for us to have somebody like you to talk. I mean, it's immensely valuable to bring your insights to the room of or to the care practitioners. I really believe that that's really where all the value is created. So thank you. And maybe one question from my side. Can I use some of your PDFs, or is that, I mean, how can I use that in class, or is that sort of protected, or?
So all the information that I shared here is publicly available.
Okay.
Stanford presented all the content of this project at multiple conferences. And Landspitali is also very open about what they are working on. I've not shared anything that is confidential that I shouldn't be talking about. So you're good. I'm happy to share the slides with you. Just make sure to reference us. And also, I love talking to students. I always find that really energizing to hear their questions. So I'm happy to also come to your class and do a similar presentation and maybe more focused on tools and research methods. So happy to do that.
Schirin, I think you will be booked
Thank you.
immediately.
Oh my goodness, really? Did I say the wrong thing? Okay.
No. So thank you very much,
But
everyone. And we would close the session. I stop sharing and taping. And thank you very much for being